I realized that we didn't discuss a formal introduction to starting the cluster, and I've noticed that many clusters are starting with the acknowledgement of the land, and I don't have one prepared, but if anyone here in particular wants to share an acknowledgement of the land that they're joining us from before we get started, we'll welcome that. All right. But otherwise, thank you all for joining us for the Physical Samples Curation Cluster. I'm Sarah Ramdeen, one of the co-chairs with Val Stanley, and we're joined also with Joan Damer, who's going to join us today with the breakout session. And the agenda for today's meeting is to do a brief introduction to the cluster, just to familiarize you all, those of you in particular who might be new to the group, with who we are and some of our past activities. Then we're going to share a space for presentations from related communities. That's one of the main focuses that came out of this formation of the cluster, was making sure we were engaged with the broader sample network. Then we're going to do a breakout activity, and we'll explain that later on in the session. And then we'll have some time where we'll come back together and wrap up and talk about next steps. So for the sake of time, let's move into the introduction. Val, do you want to handle this, or how do you want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to take on the next couple slides. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Val Stanley, coming to you from Corvallis, Oregon. Thank you, Shelley. See you in the chat there, helping share an acknowledgement for the land there. So I think that I'm talking to a familiar cast of characters here, but just wanted to, say that the focus of this group is approaching samples as research artifacts and trying to see what we can do to make them first-class citizens of the data world. And what we're talking about here is physical sample curation, so the preservation and access to those samples. And when I say preservation and access, I mean both digital and physical. So having the means to share things and make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. So where did this all come from? Back in 2019, if you don't know, there's a group of curators of marine and lacustrine core samples, and we meet every 2 years. And Megan Carter came to a meeting in 2019 and pitched this idea because we were looking for a new home for this group, because it's sort of untied to any organization and a way to continue our discussions aside from meeting every 2 years. And it's a wonderful group of people. Next slide, please. Thank you. So then the question was, so if we were to form a cluster, what would we do here? And initially the scope was quite narrow, working with just the curators group, although a lot of their questions and expertise really echo a lot of the themes of physical sample curation in general. So we were talking about where would this go? What would we discuss? Initially, we had a lot of enthusiasm talking about vocabularies for samples as a good starting point, potentially, databases for combining collections and getting the word out there. Thank you. So we started putting together some ideas and gathering some community feedback and getting joined by other community members. We began coming up with a cluster statement. So what were we going to do and who were we going to work with? And we established some themes, which are now working group topics for literature review, previous efforts, metadata interoperability, resources and infrastructure for samples, and identifiers for effective linking and citation of those samples. So the next step.
Did I skip too soon?
No, that was perfect. I actually hit the next button like I could do it myself, and you hit it exactly the same moment. Good job. At the winter meeting just a couple months ago, we had Shelley Stahl, who's joined us today, I see, give a little presentation to talk about fair data for physical samples. And she gave us some ideas and inspired our first task and cluster activity, which we are here today to work on, the development of recommendations for samples for journals and publishers. And if you would like to join those conversations that we've been kind of starting to work on this, we'll discuss outcomes of our last telecon a little later in the session. That's the 4th Tuesday of the month. The next is August 24th. And our webinar series, we also are joining up with RDA's Physical Samples Interest Group. And there will be, thanks Shelley, I see you there. Our next meeting will be in August with them. And so who do we have in the physical cluster group? I think one of our strengths is that we've got a pretty diverse group of people working with us. So people representing many institutions from around the world and working with a variety of sample types. So open to everyone. And if you haven't come to any of our monthly meetings, you should come. We'd love to see you there.
Thank you, Val. And so now we're going to move into some presentations on related activities. As she mentioned in one of our first, when we formed the cluster, again, that was a primary focus, is that we wanted to stay engaged. And I'm going to give a presentation now on sampling nature and eye samples for Kirsten Leonard, who couldn't join us this morning. And then Steve Richards is going to talk about some of the metadata discussions that have come out of the eye samples project. And then I'm going to provide a brief update on the RDA session, which we've hit on a bit, and then some updates from some other groups as well. The Research Artifact Citation Cluster that's here in ESIP, and then Shelley Stalls is going to talk about the outcomes from the COPTA session that happened on Tuesday. Okay. So the Sampling Nature is an NSF research coordination network. It was just funded in May, so we're still in the early stages of things, but the goal is to provide the vision for making the best use of integrating sample data. And we want to clarify the incentives and overcome barriers, both technological and social, and cultural and financial, to make sample community more equitable than just sharing the reuse of samples. We also want to formalize the process of gathering requirements. Sorry, at this point, the Zoom stuff is carrying over the slide, so I can't read. Apologize for that. So we're formalizing the process for gathering requirements. And so there will be a number of working groups and workshops that will focus on things like policies and standards, best practices, and then sharing those outward. And overall, that builds into that idea of wanting to raise awareness within the scientific community and the general public about the value and the role of samples. So as I mentioned, there'll be a series of workshops. Starting in year 1, we'll have the first one this fall on energy and urbanization, followed by food and health. In year 2, we'll have workshops on rivers, coasts, and oceans, and biodiversity and climate. And in the final year of the project, we'll have a working group retreat. So there are 4 working groups: standards, policies, long tail sample collection, and training materials. And the goal is that at the workshops, they'll talk about their specific topic areas, but each of the working groups will also contribute over the long term to incorporate all of these different topics. If you're interested in taking part and joining the discussion, we've developed a listserv, and the link is here on the slides. And we'll also have more information coming up soon about how to engage with the working groups in the workshops. At the moment, the working groups are developing charter statements with here are our goals that we hope to accomplish within the scope of the grant. And then once those are finalized, then they'll be shared with the broader community. So the other project, Kirsten Leonard just got funded these projects. This one was in August, and I'm working with her on these. And I realized I probably should have put the team members on the slides, but you can ask me about it, or you can find them on the project websites. But with eye samples, the focus is maximizing the value of today's samples for tomorrow's science. So to create a flexible and scalable architecture, and to build on existing identifier infrastructure, to encourage high-level metadata standards, to support community developed standards, and then also to recognize existing systems, practices, and stakeholder needs. And it's doing that through the iSamples infrastructure, which has 2 main parts: iSamples in a box and iSamples Central. I'm just going to give a brief hit on these topics, but you can read more about them in our recent publication that came out in GigaScience, and the citation is here on the slides. So iSamples in a box is a standalone containerized system that can work offline. It's supposed to be easy to deploy in a variety of settings. So it might be for community services like on the CSAR level, or it might be for individuals in a lab or an office space. It creates identifiers and stores associated metadata, and it allows discovery and retrieval of sample information, and it provides tools for managing that sample metadata, and that's the important part, that local management. It'll connect to iSample Central, which will be the central discovery and resolution services, and will have a search interface and APIs, and will also help mediate the metadata standards between the different communities that it will support. And I didn't mention that earlier, but both projects are beyond the earth sciences. They include archaeology, biology, genomics, and other domains. And the idea is that samples have value in all of these communities, and we want to make them interrelate and discoverable in some ways too. And so that's part of what I think Steve is going to talk about with the metadata requirements to support that effort. The iSample Central will also be a gateway between these iSample in a box instances and act as the identifier authority. And so at this point, let's transition over to Steve, but is there any questions about sampling nature or iSamples before we do? I think I have to stop sharing to switch to the other slides just a second. So if there's any questions while I switch over.
Should we raise our hands or just talk? Or
I can't see the chat while I'm navigating, so if you could just talk, that would probably be best.
Right. So just a very interesting, very cool. What is the actual like core data object that for example, if I'm in the iSamples Internet of Samples and I'm looking for, what are the sort of elements of this Internet of Samples?
I think that might actually be the perfect lead into Steve's talk, because he's going to talk. We've been looking at the core concepts are the sampled feature, the sampled type, the material type, and I think, is there a fourth category?
No, just the three at this point. Mm-hmm. So let's see. So what I have here was a presentation that's mostly about those vocabularies. I have another presentation that's more about the metadata model in general. I don't know which one sounds like the metadata model presentation might have been more generic. I don't know, what do you think, Sarah?
Oh, sorry. I don't know. Well, let's see. I'm just taking an eye at the time. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we don't have much. Let's just go with this. This is quick.
Okay. Yeah.
So the what I'll be talking about here is we've been working on developing a metadata model. If we could switch to the next slide here, and yeah. So first of all, the definition of material sample or physical sample that we've been working from, that I've sort of been focused on, is based on the SSN kind of thinking, where the material sample is a physical object. And the reason it's a sample is because it's intended to be representative of something in the world that we're interested in, and we want to make observations and measurements about. So this is the basic idea. So if we go to the next one, then if we're thinking about this as a physical object, right? The things we want to know is what kind of object is it and what's it made of, first of all. And next slide. Then the other big question, if it's representative of some physical thing, well, what is that thing that it's supposed to be representative of, that it makes it a sample? So to that end, from the point of view of, let's go to the next one. So the process that we used here is, as Sarah mentioned, we're dealing with samples from the Smithsonian, which in large part are biological samples of various sorts. The Genome Project, which are more interested in genomics. We're looking at open context, which has mostly archaeology and some anthropology related samples. And then CESAR, or basically geologic samples. So we've got these different domains, and we're trying to build a metadata scheme that'll work across these. So we have these high-level categories we're interested in. What kind of thing is it? What's it made of? And what does it represent? What's the sampled feature? So what we tried to do is, by looking at a bunch of metadata records, taking a bottom-up approach to build up a vocabulary to categorize these three different facets of describing samples across these domains. So the product at this point, with the drafts we have, if we go to the next one, we have three vocabularies we're working from. So there's a specimen type vocabulary, and you can see that on the right side is the actual vocabulary. For now, it's, the idea is to keep it small And really the utilization of this would be mostly thinking about it from the point of view of the search and discovery interface, that it gives you a means to do some high level faceting across what's potentially going to be a collection, a metadata catalog with millions of samples across a lot of different domains. So the idea is that these different facets give you a way to zero in on things you might be particularly interested in without being specific to any one of those domains. So to assist using these, we've also built these decision trees, and there's a screenshot of that. It's not big enough to read. There's a link at the end. These things are all in GitHub, and we're certainly looking for input on this, and I assume that there'll be discussion of this in the RCN. So if we move to the next one, the next one is the material type. And again, it's a very small vocabulary. It just tries to be a really high level categorization of the kinds of materials that people might be sampling. And it gives you a way to zero in on things you might be interested in. And we've been testing this with we've been prototyping, mapping metadata from all our partners using this scheme. And so far it's been working reasonably well. At the beginning, we were updating things frequently as we found problems and new things, but it's sort of stabilized in the last several weeks. And it's probably as we bring in new kinds of samples, we'll find new problems. Third one is the sampled feature. This is probably the trickiest one, which is about what was the sample collected to represent. And again, it's a very small. We try to keep the vocabulary short, so it's tractable. And in the metadata scheme, then the idea is that there would be domain-specific vocabularies that would have the more specific and granular categorization that are going to be required for scientists, in a particular domain who are going to want a much more specific kind of way to search for things, rock types, particular taxa for biology, particular archaeological sites or eras, things like that, temporal context. These other aspects would be handled with more detailed context descriptions. There would be domain-specific vocabularies, so that there would be this high-level metadata scheme and then profiles for these different domains that would define the specific vocabularies and properties that would be required for metadata under a profile, let's say for archaeology, or a profile for geochemistry or something like that. So the last slide just has the link for the GitHub where these things are located, and it's open. We invite you to come and look and check out the decision trees there. They're PDFs, and we're always looking for input and feedback. So thanks. And the metadata scheme, the full metadata schemes are there. They're implemented as JSON schema. Right now, we've been working with a prototype scheme, which is really trimmed down and simplified just to get things rolling. And we have a more complete schema that we'd like to build up to in the next phase of development app. But initially, we just want to get some basic metadata mapped and get a simple user interface up and running, just so we have something to start really exercising. So thanks.
Sorry, they're mowing my lawn right now, and they've just come up at my window with the huge leaf blowers. So I apologize if there's a bunch of noise. But thank you, Steve. And hopefully that answered. I think that was Peter who asked a question earlier. And if not, maybe we could follow up through the chat just to keep on time, or maybe at the end of the session. One of the other groups that we wanted to mention was the RDA Physical Samples Collections and Research Data Ecosystem Interest Group. As Val mentioned earlier, we're doing a joint webinar series with them. The last talk was on supporting reproducibility in a connected environmental lab notebook, and that was in early June, and the link to the description is on the slides, as well as the YouTube recording of the webinar. The next one will be on RIDs. As a way to track samples in the literature, and that will be on August 10th at 1900 UTC. And again, here in the slides, you can find a description of it, as well as the way to register for the session, for the webinar. In addition to the webinar series, the interest group is working on what's called the 23 Things document. For those of you who are not aware, a previous outcome that's very popular from RDA is a document called 23 Things for Research Libraries, I think it is, or Data Management. And it's just a list of different resources within a specific narrowed focus is the style of the document. And so they're working on a document with 23 things that are relevant for physical samples. It's in the final stages of development. There's a link to the Google Drive here on the slides if you'd like to contribute to that document or to just the discussion on what things should be included on it. And they're looking for feedback by August 24th. And then one of the other groups within ESIP is the Research Artifact Citation Cluster. I want to provide an update on what that group is working on. And I realized this morning that I forgot to update the slides based on Tuesday's session. So this has been dated, but we're reviewing the credit taxonomy for how it would fit for research artifacts. And if you're not familiar with the credit taxonomy, it's linked here on the slides. And then I'm going to have a bit of a summary on the next slide of the outcomes. But the major point was that credit doesn't work for physical samples. It's too focused on the publication model, and it's missing the aspect of the collector, which our community and physical samples views as essential. But there's still discussion needed on, again, sorry, I guess I skipped this. What are the cluster is focused on precise identification of the object, credit or attribution related to the object, and then how to access it in the future. And so once you determine these roles that are associated with this concept of credit and citation, where should it go? And that's still a discussion that's needed in that community. What they've decided though is that they were focusing on 6 different artifacts, and so physical samples was one of them. They've decided to narrow the focus of the group down to just data. And at that point, physical samples as a concept needs a home. And so we're hoping that this might get folded into the broader discussion and activity that this group is working on. If you're interested, this is just a summary of the review that the group did on the credit taxonomies and how we thought it fit or didn't fit with physical samples. I'm not going to go over in detail, but I just wanted to share some of the work that we did. And so you can get an idea of what it looks like and why it doesn't really fit for samples. And there's links to the matrix that the cluster has been working on, and also the notes related to the physical sample discussion in particular here on the slide. Okay, and now we're going to turn over to Shelley for an update from the Coptis cluster.
Hello, I think many of you actually participated in the meeting earlier this week. So let me just highlight a couple elements that we didn't actually cover in that meeting. First of all, please, if you're not on the email list, and you would know that if you received an email from me last week telling you about the upcoming meeting. If you didn't get one, hop over there. It's now being managed by ESIP, which I'm grateful for because it was manual before that, can I just tell you? And then also just to make you aware of the fact that we did this webinar series earlier in the year with some really fantastic topics that maybe not for samples, but perhaps for other things that you do, you might find relevant. And there are recordings and slides. So you can take an afternoon with a glass of wine and learn about stuff. And if you have ideas for upcoming webinars, happy to take those ideas. So what we covered in the session on Tuesday, we walked through, one of those webinars had to do with the intersection of data repositories and journal workflow. So this is think domain repository, and the moment you submit your data, you submit your paper, and the process for peer review and curation are simultaneous. So that particular piece of the workflow, Danny walked back through that on Tuesday, very high level, and shared with you the recommendations. I have them clipped in on the next slide. Don't switch yet, but we'll go ahead and formalize those recommendations and then start to go through a review and comment process, which we intend to do with the ESIP community, also with the RDA, ESESIG community, and we'll also identify, we have access to some journal communities as well to get that feedback. And then we'll be asking, primarily the burden is on the journals, as it should be. So we will be asking the journals to take steps, but there are a couple things for repositories, which I hopefully won't surprise you. And then the conversation, there was breakout sessions that we did to get your feedback on how to think about Coptis in the future. And there were some absolutely amazing recommendations. So there'll be a process to synthesize those and get them into some sort of a way to prioritize and move forward. And I know the co-chairs, I have them listed here, Helen Claves and Brooks and Kirsten and Leslie. I know they are absolutely delighted with the feedback that was received. So Brooks is already starting to dig in. He's pretty excited. And I know the others are as well. So next steps will be engaging. So if you could go to the next slide. So those are the recommendations. And I on the original slide, it said journal recommendations. They're actually recommendations to journals. So I flipped it around so it's clear. I think Danny fixed herself as she was saying it. I know you have access to these slides, so I won't read them. Thanks.
Thank you, Shelley. And now we have time oops. Oh, I guess it didn't update. I added a slide while you were talking that said other updates and it didn't add it to the presentation. But does anyone here, we've got about 5 minutes before we move into the breakout activity. Does anyone here that's attending have any news of other related projects that they want to share or provide updates on? Okay, so I let my awkward silence go long enough, I think, and now we're going to move into the breakout activity. So we'll start with a brief recap, an introduction to the activity of what inspired it, what's been done so far, and then we're going to go over the task for you guys to work on in breakout groups. I think we set it up with 4 groups, but it'll depend on how many people are actually here. So we'll take a peek at that. We're about at 24, so that I think 4 groups might still work. And then we'll go, we'll talk for about 30 minutes on the prompts, and then we'll come back and have time for each group to report out before then we move into some closing and wrap up points. Okay. So Val, do you want to talk about this first slide?
Yeah, happy to. So just giving you guys some context for what we're about to embark on here. So we were kind of thinking about, or at least for me, when I'm thinking about, okay, so if we want to have recommendations, let's look at some examples here. So here is a link to an example of data sharing guidance from AGU. And kind of the example that was sort of popping out was the software citation one on pages 14 to 18. And it's about a 4-page chunk, and it has kind of a couple of key elements on a checklist for citation. It lists what kinds of software should be cited and what not to cite. And so I think that's kind of analogous here of like which samples should be cited and which ones don't need to be. How should you cite your software? So similarly with samples, and I think there's a bunch of different use cases that we need to think about there. It's not quite so straightforward, as well as some examples of how that's done, which is, I think, pretty helpful.
Yeah, and so sorry, I realized we didn't announce what the breakout activity is.
Right. Surprise.
So as I mentioned earlier, Shelley gave a presentation at our last, was it the winter meeting, right? The winter meeting session that we held, and talked about this need for requirements related to samples for journals. And so the group has taken up as an activity that we would like to draft some sort of statement of recommendations about samples for journals and publishers. And so what Val just shared and reviewed is an example of what sort of things would go into that recommendation. And then at our last monthly telecon, we actually spent a brainstorming session to talk about what key points would go into these recommendations for samples. And so here are some of them, such as samples should be cited. I think that seems to be a big important theme that we can acknowledge, and that they should follow appropriate protocols. They should acknowledge the organization that provided the samples, and should include a persistent identifier. If you follow the link at the top of this, you'll see more of our in-depth discussion on each of these points as well. The citation should have specific properties. samples should be cited according to the right level of granularity, and that they should, if possible, be resolvable in the text or tables. And so these are some of the high level concepts. And then for the breakout, we're going to get into more of this discussion about, well, how should samples be cited? What are the recommendations are needed? What is included as far as the format and style of the citation? What's the scope? Is it an individual sample collection data sets? Is it a dynamic data set? And that might vary for different domains. And so we might need to have recommendations for each of those types. And then along with the scale as well, again, we might need recommendations. Are you setting one sample? Well, that's easy. Are you setting 1,000 samples? Well, that gets a little bit more tricky. You can't just put them in a table in the paper. Who gets cited and where does it go? And then best practices for using persistent identifiers in that as well. Was there anything else, Val? Sorry, I spoke on your slide. Was there anything else you wanted to add before we move on?
No, I think that's great. I should have made those slides the other direction first. I have to, flip-flop them. Yeah, I think, yeah, I guess I would also say if you didn't go to the movie credits session earlier this week, there was some good discussion there. Also on the research artifact stuff that you mentioned. And just talking about what kind of the nuts and bolts of that would look like and who gets cited and that sort of thing. So work has been done on that piece.
So now we're going to take and break out into breakout groups, and we're going to ask that each of you identify a note taker and a reporter, so someone to take some notes into the slides that we've provided for the breakout groups, and then also to then have someone who's going to report back when we come back to that group discussion with your key findings. And so for each group, we've created 2 different topics. One is on a workflow to publish samples and related data. And for there, we're looking for some ideas and examples that might go along with it. Sorry, let me pull up my own notes about this. So what has already been done in the process? So can you provide us with an example of a workflow that we could emulate or link to as a resource in whatever documentation we create? And then on the second topic is sample citation use cases or recommendations. So that would be then to identify, we provided some examples to consider. So what kind of citation is needed, and then what would be the use case where that would work, and what recommendations would you have for it? And so on for each group, there is 3 blocks where an example, a recommendation that you might have for it, and then some challenges that might need to be addressed to move that forward, that we might then fold into what this community elicits and gathers from the community to help support. Joan, was there anything that you want to add about the breakout group before we hop in?
No, I think you covered it pretty well.
Okay, so I think, and we didn't talk about this with Megan, but is it possible to put each one of us leads into one of the breakout rooms?
Yes, I've already done that. So,
oh, perfect.
Yeah, Joan, Sarah, Val, you're all in different rooms. So. Okay. And people are dropping like flies, so I suggest we open them very soon.
Yes, I was gonna say maybe just the 3 rooms instead of 4 then.
Okay, I can.
Or if that.
I'm gonna keep it at 4. I think we still have 4 people in each room. That way, it's still a good size. That's all right. All right. Okay, come back to the main room if you have any questions. And 30 minutes, Sarah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And do we actually have Dave as well?
Dave said in the chat he had to step out. So I think.
Okay. So he is not here right now. So.
That can be a bonus. Yes.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. But anyway, what I was saying right before then, Pierre, great discussion about that, because that's something that we deal with, kind of the level of representation of samples. Well, because people do make assumptions that it is more representative than maybe it was than its original collection purpose.
Yeah, but it's like an error propagation case, because
right.
When you're doing that in a confined setting, that's okay. You can figure it out and then make a decision about whether or not it is representative in the sense that you need it to be.
Right.
But when you have it in a framework, like a whole internet of samples.
Right.
There's no time to check whether the scope of the representation is appropriate or works. And so that it becomes an error propagation scenario. So this is why like a neutrality on that I think is good, just engineering. And then, or, to separate it, to have something about a separate slot to say that this is intended to represent, and then you can specify what it is. And that's a claim, that's treated as a claim as opposed to something inherent to the sample.
Yeah,
that sounds right on to me. I wasn't totally following the chat, but the concept of representativity was really bothering me, for that reason, representative of what to whom. So yeah, I think that was well put. Could I just mention one thing that was bothering me? So I'm just going to blurt it out. So you have a sample. We're seeing more and more work where people are taking a sample and resampling it or deriving other, I'll call them samples from that original sample, like Bob Hazen's talk, where he was talking about essentially cosmic materials that had been found in meteorites, right? Like the 5 billion year old diamonds. So, okay, the meteorite, you couldn't call it representative, I don't think, but you have a physical meteorite, but then you're doing all this complex resampling or whatever you want to call it of the material in the meteorite, or you have a core sample, and now maybe you're actually looking at genomic data that you're extracting from that core sample. So the question of how that kind of work is handled, what was bothering me, and I have no idea whether that's already been addressed or not, or whether it's outside the scope completely and inappropriate.
Well, I think it's a little outside the scope of what we're supposed to be working on right now. And in some cases, like what you're talking about, Steve, kind of the subsampling, my experience is primarily with geologic cores, originally collected for oil and gas.
Right.
And people subsample those.
Right.
And they should be, we're trying to get this to happen, linked back to the original core.
Yes. Right.
Right. So there's that connectivity. And with the geologic formations, it becomes that subsample can become representative of that particular strata. So the representativity of the subsample might be different than the representativity of the entire core.
Yeah, definitely. Right.
So
we bumped into a similar issue or case when we were doing some ontologies for samples, biological samples. I think Ramona, Walls, and others led this. And, we say subsample, but a subsample is also just a sample that is a sample of a sample, right?
Yes.
Right.
And in terms of, again, when we think about engineering this for an information system, you can do that by, and also accomplish that goal with a subsample of what, by just saying it's a sample. And then you just have to say, what did it come from? The provenance chain, right?
Yeah.
And then the machine can infer automatically that if the origin of a sample was another sample, then it is de facto a subsample, right? Without having to then run into defining what subsamples are, creating new slots for it, etc. That's all handled in the provenance chain, and it's a more elegant solution in terms of design.
Yeah, and Megan may remember with IGSN, that is essentially how it works, right?
Yes. Well, I think it wasn't totally built that way. Like the subsample had all of its own attributes, but often the subsample had all the same metadata as the parent sample. So you can't really distinguish them other than to know they're related. And that's what I was going to say. It's like when you take another sample, how do you really actually distinguish it other than to say this is, because we weren't recording enough things to show.
Right.
I mean, maybe like a depth increment or something would differentiate it, but not much else.
Right. Or in the case, a lot of the stuff that I do, the actual sample type, if you drill down, it's a geologic core, or it's a plug, or it's a thin section. So that would tell you it would be a subsample as well. But yeah, that might be something to think about, and about how to handle that. I'm trying to capture that. So do you guys have the link to the slides where we're supposed to be working and taking notes. I will drop it in. We are on slide 7 because we're group 4.
And really quickly, Andrea, you might have just joined us. We are one breakout room of several, and you haven't really missed much. Well, not a ton. We are in the slide presentation that I just popped in the chat box. And if you go to slide 7, we are about to start discussing these questions further.
Another, again, just throwing out things that were bothering me or that I was thinking about earlier. How is it important to try to capture how was this sample collected? You know, especially it won't be universally applicable, but if someone is trying to reproduce work later, that could be fairly important. And definitely when it comes to subsampling, definitely how is this subsample taken or collected from the sample? So again, just throwing that out there is something that was on my mind.
Right. So there is there are a couple facets to that. At least in my experience, there's, you know, ideally what you'd do, you know, kind of what you envision before you go take the sample. And so that could be, you know, sampling methodology or sampling plan. And then there's the practicality of sometimes you can't access where you wanted to drill, for example, or the drill doesn't work right, or, you know, or when you're doing subsampling on a core, the holders of the core in, you know, our survey has to sign off on where you want to take samples, and we may or may not allow you to take that sample depending on the condition of the core at that location, how much we have of it. Right, because we need to maintain, we are legally and regulatorily required to maintain a certain percentage of any core that is related to a permanent oil and gas well.
Okay.
And so if we don't have, you know, it's like if we have both the butt slab and the other half, if we have both halves, it's a little bit easier. We maintain one as an archive and one for sampling, but we don't always. Companies, for example, are only required to submit a minimum of a quarter slab of core.
Okay.
Because honest to God, we just don't have the space to keep everything right now.
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know, so this is a long way to say that I don't know if there's a limited controlled vocabulary that you can use for something like, you know, sampling plan, sampling methodology. It gets complicated, but it's really important to understand, you know, how it was determined, right?
Yeah, and maybe at least in the near term, it needs, I hate to say it, but essentially a link to a text, you know, sort of a free text description, or I don't know. But I think too about the with biological specimens where, okay, you have an organism and maybe it's sitting in a museum collection, and now someone is interested in looking for parasites that might still be identifiable within the host organism. And so they're going to do something to look for parasites, but what's their protocol? And if they in fact found some parasites, you know, arguably those are subsamples. Again, the representativity question pops up. But.
Right. I think we're discovering that the representativity question is probably a bigger thing than
But I mean, it's always good to, again, to retreat to that level of neutrality. You're making no claims about that and handle that in a separate slot, essentially.
Yeah.
Slot.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate that. And like I said, you know, even there, it's like, I think we are agreeing on the basics and the importance of that.
So can I just interrupt really quickly?
Yeah.
This first bullet point about handling subsamples, I had been thinking about it from the sort of management of the sample metadata perspective, but my biggest question when it comes to recommendations to people about publishing on samples is what is the recommended granularity? You know, do you just cite the parent sample, or do you cite, you know, the 300 subsamples that you took of the parent sample? Or for some sample types, some types of research, you know, you would never ever publish a list of every single sample that you had. So I think that's like the question I remember hearing a lot, like, what do we recommend and how do we recommend? Is it a table? Is it, you know, do we frown on putting these things in text? General logistics of this too, I think.
So I think Pierre actually commented with a solution, with a possible solution or a recommendation, you know, getting a DOI for a collection of DOIs.
Yes, and I've definitely heard that one as an option. But I guess like there might be situations where you wouldn't want to do that. So just clarifying, like, yeah, I just think that that's like a longer discussion that should be had and people need to understand.
In some ways, yes, but at the same time, you know, we're dealing with a limited web architecture here. There aren't so many ways to go about that aside from creating a collection object of some kind that references these. And this could be either a collection by design or a collection by opportunity, a collection by happenstance. You know, all of those are possible. But again, you can identify that with an identifier, a DOI or so. I think GBIF decided to do this because it was the only way that they could, you know, attractively think about handling that, especially with the publishers, because the publishers can't include so many citations currently in the typical way we publish things. But that DOI helps because then, you know, you can create an ad hoc collection, get your identifier for it, and it's then more reproducible, you know, machine readable.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if those things were subsamples or if they came from different origins, etc., that shouldn't be dealt with in that identifier. That should be dealt with in the provenance chain of each one of those samples. So every material sample would have its provenance slot, and then you have a prov record or something to say where it came from.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about how do you tell your average scientist what they need to do?
Yeah.
I don't mean average scientist, but, you know, somebody who's not as steeped in this as.
Yeah, like somebody like without the informatics training. I think a lot of it is like creating a system that's more like form filling, that just feels, okay, it's an intuitive question to ask. Where did you get the sample? Can you put in the identifier of where you got this from? What was the bigger thing you sampled? They just do that, and then the prov record is woven together in the background. I mean, there has to be some interfaces here to help.
Right.
Pierre, I don't think I did not capture all of what you just said. I was listening too hard.
I'll fill that in. I was looking at the closed captioning too, and so I don't think we're going to recover it from that either.
The closed captioning has been, it's been helpful for me sometimes, particularly if for whatever reason I have a lot of background noise. I can turn that on and follow more easily. Sometimes it is very far off.
Yeah.
But generally, I've been impressed at how good it is for an automated free solution.
So maybe, do we need something more basic, like when a sample needs an identifier, or like samples should have identifiers? I think we're like a little more advanced in this, but what are the like very basic things we think need to be included as well in terms of recommendations?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, working with people, working with researchers rather than, you know, people more steeped in data. I think getting them guidelines on when and why you need a sample identifier that is not just, you know, their own personal system.
Right.
You know, yeah.
Persistent.
Globally unique and persistent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we run into this question a lot in our groups working with genomic samples from cores and water and things. Like we have from the cruise ships and things, you know, you have the identifiers that are issued for the individual casts of samples. Then in the lab, what becomes very important are what are called subsamples, or the samples of those, which then maybe only one or two of them are very interesting. But that's kind of like lab inventory information. That's at the resolution of sample management in the lab. In other words, we have like local identifiers for those, or we're experimenting with that. But imagine issuing DOIs for each one is hardly tractable, right? So I think there's a kind of somewhere between the local data management in the lab and then announcing certain things to the world, right? What is interesting, there's a balance there. Of course, you know, ideally you'd have everything logged, but this becomes massive, right? And that's for the interim before we have like a fully fledged, you know, seamless system of everything. Some way to manage locally and then decide what needs to be pushed out globally, you know, archived with identifiers would perhaps help.
So Andrea's contributed something in the chat. They think that an object needs an ID as soon as it should be touched individually. I like to use the image of a handle for this purpose. Do we need something also basic, but do we need something? So back in my data curator days, we would often see people get IGSNs for the samples, but then they'd submit the data set and not include the IGSNs for the samples. Like, do we need something basic to us that says, you know, you need to not just obtain them, but use them when you are reporting data on them? Or what is the sentence you think that needs to be?
I mean, I think so. I think that's like a basic quality control.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, indeed, sometimes there's the pressure on the researcher to get such a thing, to conform to some data management plan. But how that's ultimately used is a different question. I mean, if they truly understand the importance of it or where it is and invest the actual time to make sure it goes. So I think when receiving these records in something like iSamples or other frameworks, some kind of QC, QA to say, we don't recognize this identifier, you know, we can't resolve it somewhere.
Yeah.
Why, right? To get an explanation.
Yeah, that's true, because that was a manual step at that point to even make sure that there were valid identifiers.
So I think I captured the gist of that with, you know, when and why you need one, and then how to use and why to use these identifiers, you know.
So we have 8 minutes and 24 seconds left. I don't know if we feel like we've put enough on this page. Do we want to look at the other slide? Is that, or we can stay here and just.
No, I think we only, we have a whole nother slide.
Yes.
Oh, geez.
No.
I just thought that these were the ones that we had to do.
I just realized that. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's the sample citation use cases and recommendations.
Should be done.
Well, it could be some of the things that we've put on this first one might go under what should be included in citation recommendations.
Yeah, we've been talking about citation a lot. So
yeah.
a little confused.
Yeah.
So what I don't think I'm seeing is something about collection protocol, or whatever term is most appropriate to use.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the who contributed thing.
So, like the metadata record should include specifics on sampling, yeah, or subsampling if applicable. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, basically, I mean, I think it comes down to potential reproducibility, right? That if someone else is wants to try to reproduce your results, are you providing enough information so that they might have a shot at it if they don't run into a stone wall, which they might for various reasons, like what Denise described, that we're sorry, but we have no more core to share.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I think that's also that kind of thing should be captured. It's like ideally we would have sampled here, here, and here. And that's often captured in the text of an article, or sometimes it's captured in the text of an article. But ideally it would be captured with the sample itself rather than a publication.
At least that the sample links to that information, so
mm-hmm.
that you can navigate there readily.
Mm-hmm. I've also put that under, what are the challenge, proposed solutions, tools needed to generate citations for samples. So I already included challenge, how to handle collection plan method protocol.
Does it make any sense to capture something about communicating benefits to researchers, so that they understand that there are benefits to following good practices, that
mm-hmm.
it's not just mindlessly adding more work for them, that there can be payoffs?
Yeah, and I did see that come up. Well, we sort of discussed it on the other side, and I see it also in I'm peeking on some of the other groups too. They definitely hit home on that one.
Okay.
So I'd seen someone had put in, it's like the personnel identifiers. I think that it should be, it should be captured somehow, like in the sample identifier, but it hasn't always been. And, that when we were talking about, every time that I've been involved with the research artifact citation, kind of the granularity of that personnel comes into question, and where and how much credit they might receive. So I don't know how to capture that here.
Mm-hmm. One could consider, if you want to be very granular about that, the prov record will say this person did that. This is the agent of this step, etc. So you could encode it that way if you want that granularity. Say, who was there in the field, who worked it up in the lab, who, you know, curated it in a museum. Could be a way.
Mm-hmm.
I put that in the sub-bullet point.
Mm-hmm.
Am I really so inarticulate, like based on the transcription? Like you can understand what I'm saying, right?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
All right.
So I added this bullet point on enforcement, who is responsible for validating and how.
Mm-hmm.
Is anybody going to, or how are we going to make sure people do this? Does the identifier real? Does it?
Yeah, so this is for me, this is a hard question.
Because there aren't really mechanisms for validating either, even if
right,
had to do it.
Right. Because if something is not directly related to a traditional publication, you can't say, oh, publishers will always enforce this.
Right.
Right. But these things should still somehow be enforced, and how to convince institutional repositories that, you know, essentially became repositories because they had to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, either they were legally required to, or, you know, they recognize that it's valuable, and so someone has to keep it.
Yeah, and I think I put in a bullet point there about we need specifications to say what are you validating against. So of course, you know, you can't write validators for everybody and expect them to use it, but you can say, look, here's the specification of what if we're doing a citation, the object being cited should meet the following specifications. Here they are. That allows people to write such checks locally if they need to, so inside their own internal databases, to make sure that things are compliant, however they like to do it, so they don't have to use an external tool if they don't want to, or if they can't, you know, if there's like a legal block there. But I think that's the thing. People need to know what they're supposed to conform to. And the more minimal and sort of approachable that can be, the better, because then you'll know. Because then you can't leave it to the journal, because like some reviewers may see it, some reviewers won't, right?
Right.
And very few journals have like technical editors that are actually going to check all of this stuff computationally. And so if the peer reviewers are happy with it, it gets there. But most of the stuff just doesn't work anyway. You know, it's tied to the paper. Oh, people are coming in.
Yep.
I guess we're wrapping.
Yes. We didn't determine who's going to be our reporter, though. I nominate Pierre.
I'm new to this thing. I don't know what I'm talking about here. I'm just saying.
I nominate you, Denise.
I second that.
Trat.
By acclamation.
Okay, I can do that.
Thank you.
No problem.
Is everyone back from the breakout rooms?
Everyone who's here is.
Well, I don't know how, I can't see the breakout rooms anymore, so I wasn't sure if they're still there or if they've been officially closed and everyone's been kicked back.
I think we want to wait a couple more seconds.
I mean,
it looks like
if they were in the rooms when they were
Joan.
they're not coming back, I think.
Oh, no, wait, here we go. We just got a whole parade of people. That's great.
Great.
There we go.
Okay. So then we've got, we wanted to give about 10 or so minutes and to recapping what each group discovered. And so do we want to start with group 1, room 1?
I think that makes sense. And I would invite anybody from the breakout session to add on to what we kind of actually summarized at the end. And I think what we focused on was sort of what is the purpose of the citation, and that generally just making samples more findable and discoverable is really what we're out to do here. And that one of the probably important and things to sort out is how to kind of combine citation or combine identifiers. So okay, so if we're using IGSNs here, people are most certainly in publications talking about related data sets, and how do we want, and these specific people have org IDs, and how to kind of chain those things together.
Does anyone else want to add anything before we move on to group 2?
Doug?
I'm being called out because I rat-holed the whole conversation. But I mean, we were really talking, I think, about how these samples are going to exist in a larger context, right? And so that context is potentially other identifiers. It's potentially links to other resources and concepts, or even and then how those vocabularies are going to work as well. And and all this plays into the discoverability of it in this kind of linked open data, structured data on the web pattern. And then what's interesting though is how do we connect that then to the functional goals, right? There's going to be a core set of metadata, but you're going to have a lot of communities talking about samples, and they're going to have a very diverse set of both functional goals, and they're going to have a very diverse set of things that are important to them that a sample just isn't a sample without, in terms of the metadata record associated with that sample. And so there's a lot of governance that's going to be involved, I think, that's coming down in how to mediate those. And so, yes, I apologize for what I did to group 1.
No, no, thank you, Doug. No, I think that these are really important things, and I appreciate Doug's perspective on these things because I wouldn't have thought of that. So yeah, getting the guidance out there and getting those resolvable too.
All right, so group 2.
Yeah, so I guess we started with the workflow and discussed some specific things that should likely be included in recommendations. And Shelley was in our group, so she gave some useful feedback on like what is actually needed for these kinds of recommendations. And so some of those things included just providing some specific examples of samples and sample data, and then specifically citations, but also like the availability statement and what that looks like in different scenarios. In some cases, samples may be available, in some cases they may not, and that may be true especially for different sample types. Also, how the sample should be included in the methods, like how you should address samples and methods and data sections, including like a value statement on why you collected a specific set of samples and why it's valuable. What are the possible persistent identifiers, and when do you need a persistent identifier for samples? Yeah, so just in general, providing author guidance on availability and citation, and then some sample management guidance on how to pick a persistent identifier, the basic metadata, and things like that. And then for citation, we were just talking about some of the complexities there, and some specific use cases. We didn't really have specific use cases for sample citation where you would cite individual samples in a reference section, and that might be problematic in some ways, just depending on the number of samples that you have. The most common way to, I think, to do it now that we mentioned is to create a sample data set, but that might not always be possible for some specific use cases. But you may be able to create like some of the basic like guidance that we can provide currently is to create a sample data set that might include the persistent identifiers with the metadata associated with those. But then there's a lot of complexities on how we would track that in metrics if we want to be able to track usage of samples. And so, so yeah, we just kind of scratched the surface on discussing some of the complexities with citation. Does anyone have anything to add there? And Shelley also mentioned just the need to discuss with the repositories how we want to expose the linkages of samples to data sets and do that automatically. And that's a big issue to work through.
It's really cool. So I'll speak on group 3 now, unless anyone wants to add anything, but it's really cool to see that we've all talked about different aspects of all of this with some overlap, but yeah, sorry, my meta analysis of the conversation here. But so group 3, we talked about when we were looking at the concept of workflows, the idea of maybe looking at agile project management. And so Denise, your poster from, I think it was AGU was mentioned. I think it was a poster that you had. So we need to get that citation for our recommendations. And to check in on what the community, the biology community is doing. But there really was, and this overlap with what Joan was talking about as well, is there's a need for information on what needs to capture and when, like doing it very early and being inclusive, and perhaps creating a checklist of what that information needs to be, which might include capturing the metadata, the relationship between the samples, the persistent identifiers, and so on. And we talked about a few other topics, but one of the ones I thought was really interesting too was, again, the ethics in these practices of citations. This came up in our telecon, our monthly telecon as well, of, as I mentioned earlier, using those appropriate protocols, but that really comes out of these being ethical in the discussions. In regards to, sorry, transition slides, the use cases, we had some really interesting conversations there again too about roles and contributor roles, and that sometimes the roles might be interdependent on each other. So perhaps the publisher is also the collector. So where do they get acknowledged, and how often, you know, do you address them? And it gets a bit complicated with that. And so there might be some recommendations on those procedures. And then we also talked about this issue of different needs for legacy samples versus moving forward. So in the citation itself, might you need to reference somewhere or have different guidelines for the citation if it's a legacy sample, because maybe there isn't the same expectations of availability of metadata and information about the samples. And then we ended with this really great conversation about how these samples were paid for by someone. And hopefully I get what Howard was saying right, but he was talking about how this benefit back into the ecosystem and being able to reimburse future research. So I think that gets to, we need to highlight the value of this effort of doing some of this work of citations, curation, and metadata capture, but also communicating to funders the value of these collections and this effort and this credit and concept on how it feeds back into that ecosystem. Does anyone from group 3 want to add anything before we move on to group 4? Okay, so group 4, do you want to share?
Sure. And Steve, Pierre, Megan, Andrea, feel free to chime in as I talk about this. We went a little rogue, which of course, Sarah, I'm sure you expected with me in the group. So we started out with continuing the conversation that Pierre and I had started in chat about the representativity of a sample and how you capture that, you know, and so yeah, we spent some time talking about that and talking about how we really do need to link in provenance and prov records to more fully capture a lot of that, and including that as also a way to try to elegantly capture subsamples, and how to handle, you know, collections of DOI, you know, massive numbers of DOIs, you know, how do you handle that? You know, one possible solution is kind of a collection DOI, and then what information is captured in that. You know, we also talked a lot about the sampling and subsampling method and how that should be captured, and as well as, you know, there is maybe an ideal sampling method, or you had a sampling plan and then circumstances changed that for whatever reason. The example I used is the cores that we are required for permitted wells to keep at least a quarter slab. And so if we don't have that much, someone can't create a destructive subsample. And so they may choose a different, the spot that they may have wanted to sample, they physically couldn't. So kind of capturing some of that information as well. And let's see. So we also, we also talked about kind of who's going to QA, QC this type of information. Not all samples are going to be linked to a publication, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't still be cited in some way or as part of some sort of collection of objects. And including kind of the credit for the personnel involved. I heard that come up in a couple things. I think I captured everything more or less. But Steve or Pierre, please kind of fill in the blanks.
We also touched on the communicating the benefits of following these practices. So it sounds like at least one of the other groups did as well, but we touched on that point as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it came down to just, we have a lot of needs and there are lots of issues to solve. And then we have to balance that with elegant engineering of the solution, because a lot of things can be inferred based on good provenance records. Did the sample come from another sample or original material? Who was involved? Who gets credit for which step? And then if we do that well, I think it addresses many of the issues as we go along. And then that QA/QC is really important, because citing things is easy. Citing good things, citing things that actually a machine can then pick up and use and reuse is a different story. So those sort of checks, as close to source as possible, rely on clear specifications for the citation recommendations and the citation objects. And I think, this kind of connected to the first question I asked, what is this thing that is the record? And I think with that better defined, technology can be built more confidently.
See, it doesn't sound like you went too rogue. It sounds like you did exactly what we were looking for.
Yeah, just our answers didn't fit in those boxes very well.
To talk about future benefit to society, like the NSF is asking projects to do, not just benefits to the science community and future science projects, but actual real world benefits?
Howard, that's a good point. I don't think we got there during our discussion, but that is a really good point.
It kind of touches on what was said in the previous group about, there might not always be a scientific publication, but this shouldn't actually be seen as a negative thing, because, science reports on a fraction of what it does. And there are other non-scientific things happening, operations, exploration, which are also generating samples. And I think, the data and the availability of the data and metadata will outlast the relevance of any given publication. Publications are essentially opinions and thoughts, and those get revised. They're great, of course, but at the same time, the data itself is a research object that we're building over time. So that emphasis on value to society brings us back not to the end product of the research process, but just the data itself, the thing itself. This was collected. There were these things there. It's like when we have museum collections, the very fact that somebody recorded a certain plant was present in an environment is very valuable for retrospective climate analysis, etc.
So yeah, thank you all for your participation in these groups. I think it's some wonderful discussions, and it's really great to bring it back here and have that as a full group review too, because of the different perspectives you all brought to the conversation. And so one of the things to to talk about is what the next steps are with these things. We are going to continue to have our monthly calls, which again are open to anyone to join, where we'll start refining what the outcomes from this might be. And I think, Joan, you mentioned the idea of pitching perhaps a white paper, or sorry, a paper on some of these topics. And I think just hearing all of the conversations and the amount of data we've captured in these slides today, I could easily see a paper being supported out of these conversations. And so that might be an activity that this group might take up. But we're open to recommendations as well, or other communities that we need to network with. So like with the Sampling Nature project, starting with the working groups, I'm going to take back some of these things that we've identified where maybe this group can't come up with those documents or guidelines, but perhaps one of the working groups in Sampling Nature might address the topics, and we can show them that it's a community need. But open to other suggestions or comments from this community as well. And we've got a comment from Shelley about to provide guidance as a webinar to authors collecting samples. I think that's a good idea for that joint webinar series with RDA, that perhaps maybe one of the future ones could be once we get like a couple page document out of these recommendations to share it and communicate its value. Thank you. Other suggestions?
And I think one thing that we're definitely going to do is take some of the notes from this session and some of our previous meetings and draft up a document with the recommendations that we have so far, and then send that around and start working on it as a collaborative shared document.
Yeah, so actually I'm going to put up, even though that's out of order, I want to put up this slide here that says that you can join this cluster's listserv following the link on the slides. And again, just to reiterate, we have these monthly telecons. We're not holding one in July because of the ESIP summer meeting, but the next one will be August 24th at 5 p.m. Eastern. And so these are places where you might engage in the conversation or help review the outcomes. We'll share it on that listserv. And so one of the final things, just does anyone want to share their thoughts towards, and I'll leave the slide up because I see someone writing down the link. Does anyone want to share their thoughts about the 3 takeaways that we might share with the broader ESIP community from this session? Actually, I will go back to that now if I can. But ESIP is looking for, so what do we discover? How can we help each other? What knowledge and resources do we have to share? And what are some important remaining questions? And so I think, and Megan can correct me, typically a month or so out from the summer meeting, there'll be a session where each of the clusters can, or the sessions can share a 1-slide, 1-minute presentation with some takeaways. And so I think ours might be a summary then of what we've discussed here and our discussions of next steps and how people might contribute. So I wasn't sure if anyone else had any other things that they'd like to highlight from today's conversation. Oh, and Megan says in the chat that it'll be Thursday, August 12th will be the meeting's highlight webinar. Okay.
Yeah, I'd be curious, you know, your 3 takeaways, is it, you know, one very broad and seemingly obvious one to us, but maybe not to the rest of the world, and then one from each of those slides, or is it something else? I guess I'm curious what people think.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to hear. Like, if you one thing that you're carrying away from this session, if anyone has like, this is something that they learned or discovered that they thought was important, it'd be really cool to hear that. So we might carry that forward to the broader community as well.
So I'm like a relative newcomer to this, so I could just share some reactions and reflections. So, you know, from what I discovered here is that indeed, like these objects, they require a digital presence, you know, eventually working towards something like a digital twin of the object. But first, we're just starting with a little bit of metadata describing these material samples. Now, the question is, what is that thing? What is that digital object? What's its structure? What standards does it include, like the provenance chains? What is its resolution? Does it decouple intentionality away from objective metadata? And then how do you specify what those requirements are? And on those specifications, how do you build quality control and quality assurance to make sure that they are valid citable objects, such that the citation, the PID, or the DOI to that thing can be read in by machines, and then the vocabularies, et cetera, can be more standardized if there's a specification on how they interoperate. How we can help each other, I guess, that's a lot. That's a big stack of things. That's an engineering perspective. That's making sure the domain expertise is well accounted for, fitness for purpose, et cetera. So I think developing those specifications is going to take a lot of brains to do that. From the vocabularies and semantics, that's where our clusters can also help. What knowledge and resources do we have to share? I don't know, but I guess we have a lot in ESIP. And in terms of remaining questions, it's can we build a demonstrator of this working? I think the iSamples thing probably is going in that direction, but can that be, one project? It's a project; it will end. Is this going to be lasting? Is it going to be picked up by other projects? Are we going to create this interoperable web of associated efforts? And can that be sustainable? I think that's the big one for me, sustainability.
Okay. I wrote all of that down because that was great. So thank you very much. But I think that's sort of gets back to the goal of this group, is to have that sustainability and have that nexus point where these different projects can bring in and share and connect and help support each other. Howard, you've got your hand raised.
I'm interested in just how much work there is in doing this. And I think it would be good to move towards automating most of the data collection. You know where you are, you have cameras. There are a lot of things you can do that will be really valuable that don't have to bog down the system quite as much as really going back through manually and trying to decide what was important.
And I think that's a good question, because coming from my perspective at CSAR, we get a lot of questions like that from NSF of, well, could more of this process be automated? And so that is an important consideration for this capture, especially connecting back to instruments that might capture things and automate processes. So we've got a minute left, and I just want to give a thank you all for attending, and then mention some upcoming sessions of interest. Tonight, there's a session on vocabularies for rock type categories. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern. And then you might want to look back at the recordings from the previous 2 sessions that we've mentioned here today, the movie credits for data and research artifacts, and the coordinating the triangle between publishers and data repositories and researchers. That was the COPTIS meeting, both on Tuesday, I believe. Anyone else have any final thoughts before we sign off?
To Howard's point, we could anticipate much more autonomous vehicle or autonomous mechanism sample collection in the future. So maybe that's something just to recognize. I just feel like that tracks with the idea of automating. Well, if you've got autonomous collection, a lot will be automated almost by definition, but that's just kind of a sudden random thought.
Yeah, but that's a good point too about this future we haven't envisioned yet. We talked a bit about that with sample reuse in general, like people haven't thought about how the samples will be used in the future. Well, we haven't thought about how they might be captured in the future. Mm-hmm. Denise, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, just to kind of continue on with this train of thought, I love the idea of automation, getting more of that metadata captured automatically without the researcher or the collector thinking about, oh, I have to capture all of this. Most of the people on here know that I deal a lot though with legacy samples, and that automating a lot of that is challenging. Not to say that it can't be done, but, and we have such a wealth of legacy information that oftentimes cannot be reproduced. The site doesn't exist anymore. It would be prohibitively expensive. And so making sure that we keep that in mind as we're moving forward. That sometimes we may not be able to catch what is considered that minimum necessary metadata from legacy samples.
Yeah, Liz brought that up in our breakout too, that very important aspect of legacy and that we might not be able to go back and get that information. Pierre, did you have your hand raised, I think?
Yeah, so just again, reacting to that automation thing. I mean, it's generally true. I mean, just look at our phones or whatever else, or computers. As much of the metadata that does not require expert input that can be captured by stealth, the less fatigue there will be, and the better, you know, you want a human to focus on the tricky stuff. So it's just managing human time and attention, and if it can be designed such, but that goes back to that idea of specification. So if you specify the kind of metadata products that you need to put together, you can start making decisions on which have high automation potential and which need a human brain to look at. Yeah, so I think that's an aspect there which can be done now, essentially, just to sort it out a little bit.
Oh no, I accidentally put the notes in the, okay, sorry. I'm messing up the notes. I'll fix that afterwards. But I think we were past time. And so thank you all for your contributions. This has been wonderful conversations and really great points, and we really appreciate it. And we hope to see you at our monthly telecons.
Thank you, everyone.